The morning started the way most mornings inside Clarence's house do, quietly, efficiently, and with the kind of controlled politeness that everyone inside those walls has spent decades rehearsing. Staff moved through corridors with practiced invisibility. Trays were carried. Curtains were opened at exactly the right hour. Everything had its place and its time, and the people who kept that machine running knew better than to disturb its rhythm. But that morning, and I say this now as someone who was there, someone who still thinks about it when the palace gardens come up on the news, someone who still feels the particular weight of that silence before everything cracked open. That morning was already different before anyone said a single word. I had been working at Clarence's house for just over 3 years at that point, long enough to read the temperature of a room before I'd crossed its threshold, long enough to know which silences were peaceful and which ones were waiting to collapse into something else entirely. I worked in household coordination, which is a polished way of saying I managed the invisible architecture of royal daily life. The schedules that never got published, the staff rotations, the quiet adjustments made when plans changed without announcement. I was 31 years old. I had grown up in Dorset and come to London on a graduate scheme that I'd half expected to wash out of within 6 months, but something about that world held me. Not the glamour that fades quickly, I promise you, when your job is mostly logistics and your biggest daily victory is getting the right floral arrangement into the right room before the wrong person notices it was late. What held me was the humanity of it, the way real people existed underneath all that protocol. The way you could see, if you stayed long enough and stayed quiet enough, that the people inside those walls were as tangled and tender and complicated as anyone you'd ever meet at a pub on a Friday night. And what I saw that morning was one of the most human things I have ever witnessed inside a royal household. It had been announced the previous evening. Not to the public yet, the public would get it in a few hours through the official channels, but inside, within the family's inner circle, the news had already moved like water through cracks in a wall. Prince George, the eldest son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, was to receive a formal royal title, not just his existing courtesy title, which he had carried since birth, but something substantive. Something that marked a new chapter, a formal anchoring of his position in the line of succession, a recognition that the monarchy was already, slowly, quietly, beginning to arrange itself around the generation that would carry it forward. It was a significant moment. Everyone understood that. The press office had been carefully managing the language around it for weeks, and the announcement had been crafted with the kind of precision that takes longer than most people imagine. Every word had been weighed. Every implication had been considered. The timing, the tone, the accompanying imagery, all of it had been worked out in collaboration between offices, between advisors, between people who understood exactly what these kinds of moments mean in the broader story of the institution. What had not been fully considered, or at least, what had not been considered by the people who made the decision, was how it would land inside Clarence's house. Because Camilla, Queen Camilla, as she now is, and I want to be precise here because the title matters to this story, Camilla had a grandson of her own, Tom Parker Bowles' son, a boy. A child growing up in the periphery of this world, close enough to feel its gravity, far enough to remain outside the circle of light it casts. A child whose grandmother was the Queen of England. And on the morning that a formal royal title was extended to George, on the morning that the machinery of succession made another deliberate, visible move, that boy had been given nothing. No recognition, no gesture. Not even a quiet acknowledgement behind closed doors that the asymmetry of it might sting. I did not hear what was said first. I want to be honest about what I know and what I'm reconstructing from pieces, but I know that Camilla was in her private sitting room when the final briefing came through. I know that one of her senior ladies-in-waiting was present. I know that the document outlining the formal title, its language, its precedent, its announcement protocol was brought in and placed on the table in front of her, and that she read it, fully, quietly. And then she was not quiet. The first thing I heard was a door. Not slammed, that would be too crude for these walls, but closed with an emphasis that was unmistakable. A controlled closure that carries more weight than a slam because it tells you the person doing it is not out of control. They are choosing. They are deliberate. They are furious, and they are composed at the same time, which is somehow more frightening than either state alone. I was in the corridor outside the administrative suite, reviewing the day's schedule with one of the housekeeping supervisors. We both stopped talking at exactly the same moment. We didn't look at each other. We looked at the floor, the way you do when something passes above you that you don't want to claim awareness of. It's a survival skill in that world. You learn it without being taught. Then a voice, her voice. Lower than people expect because television does strange things to people's voices, flattens them and smooths them and removes the edges. In person, in a contained space, Camilla's voice has texture to it. It has years in it. And in that moment, it had something else. A kind of raw, clean fury that I had never heard from her in 3 years of working in proximity to her life. I couldn't make out every word. I'm not going to pretend I could, but the shape of it was clear. The shape of it was, I was not told. The shape of it was, he is my grandchild. The shape of it was, do they understand what this looks like, what it does, what it says about who matters and who doesn't? The housekeeping supervisor, whose name I will not give, excused herself with a small, professional nod, and disappeared in the opposite direction. I stayed where I was because I was due to deliver a schedule update to the assistant private secretary, whose office was at the end of that corridor, and leaving would have been more conspicuous than staying still. So I stood there, and I listened to a grandmother who also happened to be the Queen of England Express, through the wall of her private sitting room, the specific anguish of watching her grandchild be made invisible on the same morning that another grandchild was made monumentally, officially, historically visible. It lasted perhaps 4 minutes, maybe 5. I have replayed it in my memory so many times that I've lost the ability to accurately gauge its duration. What I can tell you is that by the time the room went quiet again, the quality of the quiet was entirely different from the quiet that had preceded it. Before, the house had been silent in the way mornings are silent before the day properly begins. After, it was silent in the way places are silent when something has shifted, when the air itself has registered an event and is still absorbing it. The lady-in-waiting came out of the sitting room perhaps 2 minutes later. She was composed. That is her whole job. Composure is her instrument. But her eyes were doing something careful and deliberate that told me she was working hard to maintain it. She saw me in the corridor and registered my presence with a look that said nothing and said everything. We were both professionals. We both understood what we had and had not witnessed, and what the distinction meant. She walked past me without speaking. I waited another 30 seconds, then continued to the assistant private secretary's office and delivered the schedule update with my own carefully maintained composure. But I thought about what I'd heard for the rest of that day, and I kept thinking about it on the drive home. And I think about it now, years later, when I'm asked what it was really like inside those walls. Because here's the thing that people miss when they talk about the royal family from the outside, from the position of spectators consuming a story that is told to them in carefully managed pieces. They miss that these are people. Actual, breathing, feeling, aching people who live inside an institution that has its own logic, its own momentum, its own gravitational field. And sometimes the institution makes decisions that are perfectly correct according to its own internal logic, decisions that serve the narrative of succession, the architecture of continuity, the demands of constitutional convention, and those decisions land on real human hearts with all the weight of real human pain. George's title was, by any constitutional measure, appropriate. It made sense. It served the institution. Nobody with knowledge of how these things work would argue it was wrong. The timing, the framing, the substance of it all defensible, all considered, all correct. And none of that made it easier to be the grandmother, whose grandchild sat outside the frame of that photograph. I've thought a lot about what it means to hold two things at once, to be an institution and a person at the same time, to be queen and grandmother at the same time, to understand in the rational part of your mind why the world works the way it works, and to feel, in the unrational part of your heart, the sting of it anyway. Camilla had spent decades navigating exactly that kind of doubleness. She had come into this family as an outsider, had earned her place through years of quiet work and public endurance, had watched the institution move around her and through her and sometimes against her, and had remained. She had remained through things that would have broken most people. She had learned, better than almost anyone, how to hold the contradiction. But that morning, in that sitting room, she did not hold it. For 4 or 5 minutes, she did not manage it or smooth it or transform it into something the institution could absorb. She let it be what it was, which was grief and anger and love all knotted together into something that had no protocol, no precedent, no proper form. I do not think less of her for it, I think more. What happened in the hours after is a story I will get to. Because the morning was only the beginning of it, and what followed, the calls that were made, the conversations that happened, the careful and excruciating process by which the people inside that world try to address damage they have done to each other, all of that is part of what I need to tell you. But for now, I want to stay in that corridor for a moment longer. I want to stay in the quiet after the door closed and before the world resumed its professional motion. Because I think that's where the real story lives, not in the announcements or the titles or the official records, but in the seconds between things, where people are just people, and everything that's been held carefully begins, just briefly, just humanly, to slip. Outside, London was doing what London does on a gray mid-morning in the late winter season, moving, always moving, with the particular indifferent energy of a city that has seen centuries of drama, and has incorporated it all into its daily forward motion. Tourists were photographing gates. Buses were producing their mechanical exhalations. Someone, somewhere in the direction of St. James's Park, was feeding birds with the kind of focused dedication that suggests they have nowhere else to be, and are content with that. And inside Clarence's house, a grandmother was sitting in her private room with a cup of tea that had gone cold, reading a document that told the story of the monarchy's future and finding in it, in the spaces between its formal phrases, the particular silence of her grandchild's name not appearing. I think about that a lot. I think about the cold tea specifically. I don't know why that detail has stayed with me. Maybe because it's so ordinary. Maybe because it's the kind of detail that reminds you that even in the most extraordinary circumstances, the mundane continues. The tea goes cold regardless. The world outside carries on. And you sit there, Queen of England, grandmother, woman who has survived so much and learned so much and endured so much, and the tea is cold, and the document is in your hands, and your grandchild's name is not in it. And you feel what you feel. No title protects you from that. Part 2. By mid-morning, the house had resumed its official rhythm. That's how it always works in these places. The emotional event occurs, the world shudders slightly, and then the machinery reasserts itself because the machinery cannot be permitted to stop. Meetings proceed. Correspondence is answered. The calendar does not care what happened behind a closed door an hour ago. But underneath the resumed rhythm, there was something else. Something that the people who worked in that house could feel without being able to articulate it, the way you can feel a change in air pressure before you understand it intellectually as weather. Something had been disturbed. Something was still vibrating at a frequency just below the audible range of normal daily life. I spent most of that morning at my desk in the administrative wing, which sits off a connecting corridor between the main residential areas and the secondary offices that house the policy and communications functions. My window looked out over a courtyard, not the grand external courtyards that appear in photographs, but a smaller internal one, functional rather than ceremonial, where deliveries sometimes came, and where the staff occasionally took a few minutes of air between tasks. I had spent a lot of hours over 3 years watching that courtyard and finding in it a particular kind of comfort. Its smallness, its ordinariness, its complete indifference to the extraordinary things happening 20 meters away on the other side of the walls. That morning, I was working through the week's logistical adjustments. There were several, there always are, in the weeks surrounding any public announcement, because announcements generate demands that generate adjustments that generate more adjustments, a cascade of practical consequences that someone has to manage, and that someone was usually me. I was cross-referencing arrival times, vehicle assignments, the particular headache of a conflicting schedule that had developed between two separate household commitments, and I was doing all of this with the surface of my mind, while the deeper part of my mind was still standing in that corridor, still listening to what I'd heard through that wall. It was around 10:30 when things moved again. The call came. I didn't take it directly, but I know from the assistant private secretary's demeanor when she came out of her office that it had come from the Wales side, from Kensington, or wherever the Wales office was currently operating that week. They moved in those days between several locations, and I sometimes lost track. The point is the direction of the call. The point is that someone from Prince William's household had been in touch with someone from Camilla's household, and the reason for the call was precisely what you would expect it to be after a morning like the one we'd had. Damage sensing. That's the professional term I'd apply looking back. Not damage control, not yet damage sensing. The careful, diplomatic reaching out that happens when an institution suspects it has hurt someone and wants to assess the extent of it before deciding what, if anything, can be done. I know this because later that day, in a context I'll describe in a moment, one of Camilla's senior staff members spoke to me directly about it. Not in detail. There are always limits to what gets shared, even in the intimate professional proximity of household work, but enough for me to understand the shape of what had happened and what was being attempted in response. The Wales office, it seemed, had been aware of the announcement's potential sensitivity. They had discussed it. There had been conversations. I want to be careful here about the language I use, because I am reconstructing from second-hand accounts, and the specific words and their specific contexts matter enormously in a world where everything is so carefully calibrated. But the impression I came away with was that the potential impact on Camilla, specifically, on her feelings about her own grandchildren, and their position relative to George's had been raised, had been part of the discussion, and had been not dismissed exactly, but perhaps not fully reckoned with, perhaps not fully felt. This happens. It happens in institutions and in families, often both at once. You see a consequence coming and you weigh it against the other considerations, and you make a decision that seems correct on balance. And then the consequence arrives anyway and turns out to be sharper than your weighing had accounted for, and you find yourself reaching for the phone to manage the aftermath of a decision you'd convinced yourself was manageable in advance. The specific content of the morning's call, what was said, what was offered, what was or wasn't promised, I don't know. I won't pretend I know, but I know that something was put in motion. Some gesture of acknowledgement was being considered, or perhaps already drafted. Some recognition of the asymmetry, some way of marking that Camilla's grandchild existed and was seen, and was not simply a piece of collateral damage in the machinery of succession. Whether that gesture was adequate, whether any gesture could be adequate to the specific quality of that morning's pain, is a question I've turned over many times since, and I don't have a clean answer for it. What I do know is that when I saw Camilla later that afternoon, she looked like someone who had received information and was still deciding what to do with it. Not comforted, exactly. Not resolved, but no longer in the acute phase of whatever she'd been moving through in that sitting room. There was something steadier in her manner, though steadier is a complicated word when the person you're describing has spent decades mastering the art of appearing steady regardless of what is happening underneath. She came through the corridor near the East Wing around 3 in the afternoon, on her way to what I understood was a meeting with one of her charitable organization representatives. I was walking in the opposite direction with a folder of amended correspondence. We passed each other. She acknowledged me with the particular nod she gives to staff she has seen enough times to recognize without knowing specifically who they are, a nod that is warm without being personal, present without being intimate. I returned it with the appropriate small gesture and kept walking. But I noticed her eyes, and her eyes told a story her posture was working hard to overwrite. They were doing that thing eyes do when someone has been crying and has stopped and has worked hard to reset their face but hasn't quite gotten to their eyes yet. A slight heaviness at the lower lids, a quality of attention that is just slightly more interior than usual, as if part of the mind is still occupied elsewhere, still sitting with something, still processing. I think about those eyes a lot, not because the sight of someone who has been crying is remarkable. It isn't, in a life as complicated as hers has been. I think about them because of the particular context, because of who she is and what morning it had been and what had caused it. Because of the specific combination of her power and her powerlessness in that moment. She was the Queen of England. She had navigated public scandals that would have destroyed anyone with less resilience. She had stood in churches and palaces and public spaces and maintained the composure of someone who has accepted that her inner life is not available for public consumption. And on that afternoon, walking through a corridor in her own house, her eyes were still wet from crying about her grandchild being invisible. I find that unbearably human. I always have. The meeting with the charitable organization representative went on for about an hour and a half. I know this because I was nearby for part of it, finalizing some logistical arrangements that required me to be in the adjacent room, and I could hear the conversation, not the content, but the rhythm of it, the way Camilla's voice moved through the professional cadences of a meeting she had done versions of 100 times. Focused, engaged, present, all the things she has always been, regardless of what was happening in the rooms adjacent to the one she was currently in. That is something I genuinely admired about her, even in the midst of a story that is not entirely admiring in its shape. The ability to compartmentalize, not to suppress, not to deny, but to genuinely set something aside and be present for what the current moment requires, and then return to the other thing afterward. It is a skill that gets described sometimes as coldness, as absence of feeling, as the emotional hollowness of people who have spent too long inside institutions. But I don't think that's what it is. I think it's something harder and more admirable than coldness. I think it's a kind of discipline that people who carry enormous public weight develop out of necessity, because the alternative is allowing everything to happen at once, which helps nobody and damages everything. She was not cold that day. I know that for certain because I heard what was behind that door in the morning. Cold people don't make that sound. Cold people don't cry about their grandchild. Around 4:30, there was another development. One of the senior communications people, a woman I'll call H because I won't name names and she deserves her privacy, came into the administrative wing looking for me specifically. She had a document in her hand, a printout of something which was unusual enough to register, because in those offices most things existed in digital form, and a physical printout usually signaled something that needed to be handled with an additional layer of care. She closed the door of the small meeting room off the corridor, just the two of us. The room was used for confidential conversations. It was generally understood to be as private as these things get in a household, where there's always someone walking past something. She said, "I need you to adjust the family schedule for the next 10 days. She placed the printout on the table between us. On it were several items, engagements, appearances, internal family gatherings, The kinds of arrangements that don't get published in court circulars, but that form the actual texture of these people's lives. And I could see that some of them had been annotated, asterisked, flagged for modification. I asked what I needed to know to make the adjustments. She said Her Majesty would like more time with her grandchildren in the next 2 weeks. Not public, not arranged, not formal. Just time. If you can find the gaps in the schedule and protect them, that would be helpful. I said I could do that. She picked up the printout, thanked me, and left. And I sat in that small room for a moment, alone, and thought about what I'd just been asked to do. Which was, when you stripped it down to its essence, to carve out space in the life of the Queen of England, so that she could spend unscheduled time with her grandchild. The grandchild who had no title. The grandchild who would not be photographed with any official caption explaining their proximity to power. The grandchild who, as far as the institutional record was concerned, occupied no formal position in the story the monarchy told about itself. Just a child, just her grandmother's grandchild. I thought about that for a while. Then I opened my laptop and started adjusting the schedule. There are things that happen inside royal households that never make the news and never should. Not because they're shameful or scandalous, but because they're private in the most essential sense. Private in the way that grief is private, that love is private, that the things we do for the people we love without wanting anyone to see us doing them are private. The schedule adjustments I made that afternoon were never reported. The quiet visits that followed were never photographed. The time Camilla spent in the following 2 weeks with her grandchild, in the domestic ordinary spaces of the relationship they had, is not part of any official record. It is, in my view, the most important part of the story. Because the story that gets told about royal titles and formal recognition and the architecture of succession is a story about the institution, and the institution is real and important, and the decisions it makes have consequences that extend across decades and generations. I am not dismissing any of that. But underneath the institutional story, there is always another story, the story of the actual people. The people who wake up in the morning inside these walls and carry their private lives through the day alongside their public ones. The people who feel things that the institution cannot accommodate and find ways to feel them anyway, in the gaps and corridors and private sitting rooms of their actual human lives. Camilla felt something that morning. She expressed it, loudly enough that I could hear it through a wall, and then she composed herself. And then she made her way through the rest of the day with the particular professionalism of someone who has learned that the world does not stop for grief. And then she asked, through the intermediary of her staff, for something simple and unremarkable. Time. Time with her grandchild. Nothing more ceremonial than that. I find that beautiful. I find it heartbreaking. I find it both of those things at once, which is, I think, the honest response to most of what happens inside these walls when you're close enough to see it clearly. By the end of that day, the announcement had gone out to the public. The news cycle had picked it up with the enthusiasm news cycles reserve for royal developments. The analysis, the historical context, the commentary about what it means for the succession, what it signals about the future of the monarchy, what precedent it sets and what precedent it breaks. The photographs of George, careful and composed in the way children of the Wales family are always carefully composed in official photographs, were circulating across every platform. The response was, by any measure, warm and positive. People loved George. People were excited about his future. The coverage was genuinely celebratory in a way that felt, reading it from the inside, both deserved and slightly dissonant. Dissonant because I was reading it from inside a house where a grandmother had spent part of the day crying. Not that anyone outside would know that. Not that it was anyone's business, really. Not that grief, quiet, private, human grief, belongs in the news cycle alongside the official narrative of royal elevation and institutional continuity. I'm not saying the coverage was wrong. I'm saying reality is layered always, and the layers don't always speak to each other in ways that are comfortable or coherent. What I kept thinking about, reading the coverage on my phone on the evening commute home, was precedent. The word had come up several times in the analysis pieces, the precedent that George's title set, the historical precedent it drew on, what it meant in the longer arc of British royal history. And I kept thinking about a different kind of precedent. The precedent of being seen. The precedent of your name appearing in the document. The precedent of having your existence formally acknowledged in the story your family tells about itself. George had that, and it was right that he had it, and Camilla's grandchild did not have it, and Camilla had spent part of that morning in the particular anguish of that asymmetry. Two things both true, neither canceling the other out. The commute took 40 minutes. I spent most of it looking out the window at London going past in its evening form, lights coming on, people moving through the cold with the particular London walk that is always slightly faster than anywhere else, the river showing itself briefly at a bridge crossing before disappearing again behind buildings. I thought about the schedule adjustments I'd made that afternoon, the protected gaps, the unrecorded time. I thought about what it means to love someone the institution can't officially see. And I thought that's the oldest story there is. Part 3. 3 weeks passed. The public conversation about George's title had done what public conversations about royal titles always do, peaked in the first 48 hours, generated the predictable spectrum of responses from enthusiastic monarchists to indifferent bystanders to the occasional Republican, who used it as a prompt to relitigate the entire constitutional basis of the monarchy, and then faded back into the broader ongoing story of the royal family's existence in the national consciousness. The cycle had moved on. Other things had happened. The world had continued in its usual relentless forward motion. Inside Clarence House, things had continued too, but differently. I want to be precise about what I mean by differently, because I don't want to overstate it or dramatize it in a way that distorts what actually happened. The house was not transformed. The household did not reorganize itself around a new emotional reality. The schedules I maintained remained complex and demanding, and full of the 1,000 ordinary complications that fill the daily life of a working royal. Camilla continued to carry out her engagements with the focus and competence that had characterized her public work for years. The machinery of the institution continued to turn. But there was a texture to those 3 weeks that I hadn't felt before, a quality of something being worked through. Not resolved. I don't think these things resolve exactly, not in the clean narrative sense that implies a before and an after with a clear boundary between them. But processed maybe, integrated, metabolized, which is perhaps the most accurate word, because what I witnessed over those 3 weeks was not the erasure of the morning's pain, but its gradual absorption into the ongoing life of a complicated woman navigating a complicated position in a complicated world. The schedule gaps I'd protected were used. I know this not because I was there for them, but because the logistical traces of their use passed through my hands, the small adjustments to vehicle bookings, the domestic arrangements that accompany any informal visit, the particular quality of quiet that an afternoon has in a household when the principal is elsewhere, and the staff has been given something approaching time off. The visits happened. They were not photographed. They were not reported. They left no institutional footprint beyond the slight impression they made in the logistics, which I noticed and noted internally and did not document. I have thought a lot in the years since about whether it is my place to tell this story at all. I come down on the side of yes, for reasons I want to explain carefully. What I witnessed was not a secret that protects anyone's safety. It was not a confidence that, if broken, causes harm. It was a human moment, several human moments, inside an institution that has an enormous capacity to erase the humanity of the people who inhabit it, by converting their lives into symbols and their decisions into precedents and their feelings into protocol. The people who run the coverage of the royal family, the people who tell the story publicly, are almost always telling the institutional story, because that is the story the institution makes available. The human story, the story of the cold tea and the wet eyes and the protected afternoon in a schedule, that story disappears. It gets absorbed into the mythology of composure and continuity that royal families depend on for their cultural survival. I want to put some of it back. I want to say this happened. She felt this. It was real. That feels like something worth doing. About 2.5 weeks after the announcement, I had a conversation with Camilla's principal lady-in-waiting. I'll call her Mrs. F, a title she would find absurdly informal, but that's what she gets for the purposes of this account. Mrs. F had been with Camilla for years, longer than anyone else in the household. She knew her with the particular intimacy that develops between a royal and a long-time attendant. Not friendship, exactly, but something that has the depth of friendship without the equality. A relationship built on proximity and trust, and the shared experience of a great many things that neither of them would discuss with anyone else. I was reviewing a set of upcoming travel arrangements with her when she said something that I've carried with me ever since. Not as a verbatim quote, I'm paraphrasing from memory, and I want to acknowledge that, but the substance of it was this. She said that in 30 years of service, she had seen Camilla angry perhaps a dozen times. Genuinely, viscerally, privately angry, and that almost every time it had been on behalf of someone else, not herself. Never really herself, even when the anger might have been warranted. She turned inward on her own behalf, Mrs. F said. She was remarkably patient with the things that were done to her. But the things done to the people she loved, those she felt completely differently, those she could not contain. I thought about that for a long time. It reframed what I'd heard through that door in a way that felt important, because I'd been thinking of it, and maybe you've been thinking of it, following this account, as an eruption of personal grievance. As Camilla being offended or wounded by the asymmetry, feeling her own position in the family story somehow slighted by the elevation of another child. And there is probably some truth in that, because human motivations are never clean, and the line between grandparental love and grandparental pride is not always easy to locate. But Mrs. F's framing suggested something different. Something that felt, when I held it up against what I'd heard and seen, more true. What Camilla had felt that morning was not primarily about herself. It was about a child, a small person who could not advocate for his own visibility, who was not old enough to understand the significance of the asymmetry, who would carry into his life the particular experience of being the grandchild of the Queen who was not acknowledged in the story the Queen's family told about itself. That, Mrs. F implied, was what Camilla could not contain, not the insult to herself, the invisibility of her grandchild. When you understand it that way, the fury makes a different kind of sense. It stops being about a grandmother's wounded pride and becomes something rawer and more fundamental. The instinct to protect, expressed in the only form available to a woman who had spent decades learning that most of the protective instincts she felt had to be sublimated or redirected or transformed into protocol-compliant actions. She could not protect her grandchild from the institution's logic. She could not change the decision that had been made. She could not insert his name into the document after the fact or manufacture for him the kind of formal recognition that history would record. All she could do was feel the pain of his absence from that record, and in the privacy of her sitting room, say so out loud. She said so very loudly. I think that matters. I think the loudness of it matters, because the other option, the option she had used many times before in many other difficult moments, was to absorb it silently, to fold it into the vast and practiced composure she had built over decades, to add it to the long list of things that had happened to her and to the people she loved inside this institution, which she had accepted and survived and quietly incorporated into the ongoing project of her existence. That had been her pattern. That had been her strategy, and it had served her in many ways. It had kept her functional and present and capable of continuing. But on that morning it didn't happen. On that morning the silence broke before it could contain the feeling. And I think that's because some things, some specific, particular things, are too human to be institutionalized. The love for a grandchild, the anguish of watching that grandchild be overlooked, the specific pain of being the person with the most power in the room and still being unable to fix it. That pain is not protocol compliant. It doesn't fit into the forms that exist for managing royal emotion. It has no appropriate channel. So it went where it had to go, which was out, through her voice, into the room against the wall, and through that wall to where I was standing. I'm glad I was standing there. I'm glad I heard it. Not for any voyeuristic reason, I hope that much is clear by now, but because hearing it changed the way I understood the story I was working inside. Changed the way I understood the institution and its costs. Changed the way I understood Camilla specifically, a person I had observed for years and respected in a professional way without fully grasping the complexity of what she was carrying. The complexity is this. She is a woman who has spent her life being written about as a character in someone else's story. First as the third party in a marriage that became the defining romantic narrative of late 20th century British public life. Then as the quietly redeemed late bride, the unexpected queen, the woman who outlasted the contempt and emerged, through patience and time, and the particular grace of a public that eventually moved on, into something approaching acceptance. Every chapter of her public life has been written around her rather than from her. She has existed, in the public imagination, primarily in relation to other people's stories. That morning in the sitting room, she was in her own story. Completely, purely, without mediation or management, in her own human story of love for a grandchild and fury at an institution that could not see him. And for 4 or 5 minutes, the institution had to wait. I find that remarkable. I find it, in its way, heroic, not in the grand public sense, but in the small, private sense that real heroism usually occupies. The heroism of feeling what you feel when the world expects you not to. The heroism of being a person when everything around you is demanding that you be a symbol. In the final week of those 3 weeks, something else happened. Something smaller than what I've already described, but that stays with me for its own reasons. I was in the East Wing in the early evening, later than usual, finishing something that had run long when I passed Camilla in the corridor. Not in the formal, daytime passing we'd had weeks earlier, but a different kind of encounter, more accidental and therefore less protected by the professional distance that formal contexts create. She was coming out of one of the smaller drawing rooms. She was in less formal clothes than she typically wore during the working day. She looked, in a word, tired. Not depleted, not diminished. She is never diminished. That's not what I mean, but simply tired in the ordinary human way that requires no explanation. She saw me, and she did something she hadn't done in 3 years of my working in that house. She stopped. Not to address me formally, not to request anything, not in the way principals stop to speak to staff when there's a functional reason for it. She just stopped and looked at me and said, not exactly these words, but close. She said something like, "It's been a long few weeks." I said, "Yes, ma'am, it has." She nodded, just nodded, and then she said, "Thank you for all the adjustments. I know the schedule gets complicated." I said it was no trouble. She looked at me for just a second longer than the interaction required. And in that second I had the strange and certain feeling that she knew I had heard her that morning through the wall. That she had always known, probably. That people in her position always know, or assume, or have long since made their peace with the fact that privacy in these houses is relative and approximate and imperfect. And I think she was thanking me not just for the schedule adjustments. I think she was thanking me for the other thing, for hearing and not telling, for standing in that corridor and letting her have her moment and carrying the knowledge of it with the discretion that 3 years of this work had made her trust I would. I said, "Of course, ma'am. She nodded again and walked on. I stood in the corridor for a moment, alone. That was 3 years ago now. I left the household about 8 months after this, not because of anything that happened in this story, but for reasons that were my own. A different opportunity, a different life beginning to pull at me, the particular readiness that arrives when you've absorbed everything a place has to teach you and it's time to take it somewhere else. I left with genuine affection for the work and for most of the people inside it. I have never told this story to anyone before now, not because I was bound by any legal or formal obligation. I was not, but because it didn't feel finished. It felt like something I needed to sit with for a while before I could understand what it was. What I understand now is this. The story of the royal family that gets told publicly is the story of an institution. It is a story about titles and succession and the slow, deliberate march of constitutional history. It is a story about who gets recognized and when, about which names appear in which documents, about the formal architecture of power and legitimacy that a monarchy requires to sustain itself across centuries. That story is real. It matters. The decisions made within it have consequences that extend far beyond the people directly affected. But underneath it always is another story. The story of people who love each other and hurt each other and try to repair what they've damaged and sometimes succeed and sometimes don't. The story of grandmothers who cry for their grandchildren. The story of protected afternoons in calendars that no one will ever publish. The story of a tired woman in an East Wing corridor saying thank you in a way that means more than it says. That story is also real. It also matters. I've spent a long time thinking about which story is more true. I don't think that's the right question anymore. I think they're both true. I think the point is that they exist simultaneously, occupying the same houses, the same corridors, the same moments in time, and that understanding either one fully requires acknowledging the existence of the other. Camilla erupted, as the papers would eventually put it, in their breathless shorthand for a reality they were nowhere near. She erupted because her grandchild was invisible in a document that made another grandchild monumentally visible. She erupted because she is a grandmother, and some things are more powerful than protocol. And then she dried her eyes, and she walked through the day, and she made her meetings and fulfilled her obligations and carried the weight of her position with the dignity it required. And in the gaps I carved out for her, she went to her grandchild. That's the whole story, or as much of it as I know and as much as it's mine to tell. Outside, London carries on. The palaces stand where they always have. The guards change. The tourists photograph. The seasons move through St. James's Park with their usual indifference to the human dramas happening just beyond its edges. And somewhere inside all of that, a boy grows up. A boy who has no formal title. A boy whose grandmother is the Queen of England. A boy who, on ordinary unscheduled afternoons, was visited by a woman who had spent part of a morning crying because she loved him. I hope he knows that. I hope when he's older someone tells him. I hope he knows that for a few minutes on a winter morning, the Queen of England sat in a room and could not contain what she felt for him. That's worth knowing, it's worth keeping.